January 1077. The snow-covered Apennines. The fortress of Canossa in northern Italy hovers over the world, like an ark on the crest of a frozen flood. A wind, as sharp as a guillotine's blade, howls at the impenetrable walls, tearing dustings of snow from the battlements and throwing it in the face of a lone figure standing before the tightly sealed gates. This is not just any man. This is Henry IV, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, ruler of Germany, Italy, and Burgundy, God's anointed, whose word is law for millions. But now, he wears no robe, no crown. Only a coarse hair shirt, its thousands of prickly needles digging into his skin, and bare feet, already blue from the frost on the trampled, frozen snow. For 3 days and 3 nights, he has stood here, without food and almost without sleep, publicly humiliated, begging for forgiveness. And behind the thick walls, in warmth and safety, he is being watched by the one who cast him down from the heights of power into this abyss of shame. Not a king, not a general, not the heir of an ancient line, but a monk named Hildebrand, now Pope Gregory VII, the son of a simple carpenter from Tuscany. At this very moment, frozen and desperate, the emperor embodies the greatest paradox of the age. How? How did spiritual power, represented by a man from the lowest rungs of society, manage not just to challenge, but to bring to its knees the most powerful secular force in the Christian world? This question, carved into the icy air of Canossa, echoes through the centuries. This is not just a story of a conflict between two men. It is the story of the birth of a new idea, of a revolution in consciousness, of how the intangible power of faith was forged into a fearsome political weapon, capable of shattering thrones and redrawing the map of the world. To find the answer, we must immerse ourselves in the world that created these titans, a world where the sword and the cross clashed in a mortal struggle for the soul of Europe. To understand the drama of Canossa, one must first see the great chessboard on which it was played, the Europe of the 11th century. It was a world woven from brutal contradictions, a world of barbaric strength and sophisticated faith, a world where a man's life was worth nothing, yet his immortal soul was the subject of a furious struggle. The Holy Roman Empire, heir to Charlemagne, was not a state in the modern sense, but rather a patchwork quilt of duchies, counties, and bishoprics, stitched together by the iron will of the emperor. The monarch's power was absolute but constantly contested. Every powerful feudal lord, every German prince, was a potential rebel, waiting only for an excuse to drive a knife into his sovereign's back. And the emperor's main tool for controlling this seething mass of ambition was the church. It was the emperor who appointed bishops and abbots, granting them lands and power. These spiritual princes were his support, his officials, his viceroys. The church was, in essence, a department of the imperial administration, but the church itself was experiencing a profound crisis. The papal throne in Rome had become a plaything in the hands of corrupt Roman aristocratic clans. Popes were changed like gloves. They were murdered, overthrown, sometimes placing youths or outright villains on the throne of St. Peter. Clerical offices were bought and sold like goods at a market, a phenomenon known as simony. Many priests and even bishops openly lived with wives and concubines, passing on church property to their children by inheritance. The spiritual authority of the papacy was at rock bottom. It was weak, humiliated, and completely dependent on secular rulers, primarily the German emperor, who considered it his right not only to appoint bishops throughout Europe, but also to approve or depose the Roman pontiffs themselves. This fragile, rotten balance of power, where the emperor was the de facto head of the Western Church, and the Pope was his high-ranking but subordinate official, was the powder keg into which the carpenter's son, named Hildebrand, was preparing to toss a lit torch. In this world, torn by power struggles and corrupted by greed, in the small Tuscan village of Sovana, around the year 1020, a boy named Hildebrand was born into the family of an ordinary carpenter. His origin is the key to understanding his entire character and mission. He was not an aristocrat. No blue blood flowed in his veins. He was a man of the people, who saw the world not from a palace window, but from a workshop that smelled of fresh wood shavings and hard labor. This fact was forever imprinted on his consciousness. For him, the grandeur of the aristocracy, which boasted of its pedigrees, was an empty sound. He saw their greed, their cruelty, their ignorance, and he saw the power of the church, not the corrupt and humiliated one, but the ideal church, the bride of Christ, which was meant to stand above all kings and emperors, as the soul stands above the body. His origin gave him what his future enemies lacked: a contempt for worldly vanity and a fanatical, unbending faith in the one true hierarchy, the hierarchy of the Spirit. While still a youth, his uncle, the abbot of a monastery on the Aventine Hill in Rome, took him in. And here, in the heart of the Christian world, Hildebrand saw with his own eyes the mire into which the Papacy had sunk. He saw the throne of St. Peter being sold for money. He saw Roman barons place their puppets upon it. This experience did not break him, but rather tempered him, turning his youthful idealism into a cold, calculating fury. He realized that the world was sick, and the name of the disease was the interference of secular power in the affairs of the Church. And then, in the soul of this thin, unassuming-looking young man, the son of a carpenter, a dream was born that seemed madness to his contemporaries, not just to purify the Church, but to turn the world upside down, placing the power of the Pope above the power of the Emperor. He did not yet know how he would do it, but the shadow of a simple carpenter's hammer was already being cast over the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. While the young Hildebrand was absorbing the bitterness of Roman decline, a fire was already igniting across Europe that would light his way. It was the great movement for church reform, born within the walls of the Benedictine monastery of Cluny in Burgundy. The Cluniac reform was not just a set of rules. It was a spiritual explosion, a response to a deep crisis of faith. The monks of Cluny put forward a program that sounded revolutionary for the 11th century. First, they demanded the strictest observance of celibacy, the clergy's vow of chastity. This was not just a moral principle, but a powerful political tool. A priest without a family and children would not seek to pass on church property by inheritance. He would be completely devoted to his one master, the Church. Second, they fiercely fought against simony, the buying and selling of church offices. This undermined the very foundation of imperial control over the Church, as emperors used the distribution of bishoprics to buy loyalty. And third, and most importantly, the Cluniacs proclaimed the idea of the Church's complete independence from secular authority. They argued that abbots and bishops should be elected by the clergy, not appointed by kings and barons. And at the head of this free, purified Church should stand the Pope, whose authority was higher than that of any monarch. The ideas of Cluny spread across Europe with incredible speed, creating a whole network of like-minded monasteries. It was like the birth of a transnational spiritual corporation, united by a single idea and strict discipline. Hildebrand, having visited Cluny, saw in this movement not just hope for purification, but a ready army, an ideological platform for his future struggle. He realized that the prophecy of a great and independent church was already coming true, and that he was destined to be the one to make this prophecy a reality, even if it meant burning the old world to the ground. For Hildebrand, Rome became not just a place of study, but a true furnace where his character was forged in fire and steel. The Eternal City in the mid-11th century was an arena of ceaseless struggle. On one hand, there were the ancient walls, the basilicas, the breath of apostolic tradition, a sense of holiness that permeated every stone. On the other, the brutal reality, streets controlled by gangs of warring aristocratic clans, such as the Tusculani and the Crescentii, who treated the papal throne as their family property. Hildebrand witnessed the so-called cadaver synod, when the body of one pope was exhumed to be put on trial. He was a witness to a time when 3 popes sat on the throne simultaneously, cursing each other. This experience taught him cynicism and pragmatism. He understood that holiness and prayers alone were not enough to win in this world. For divine justice to triumph, earthly tools were needed: money, alliances, intrigue, and, if necessary, force. He served as chaplain to Pope Gregory VI, who, ironically, had bought the papal throne to put an end to Simony. When Emperor Henry III deposed this pope and sent him into exile in Germany, Hildebrand voluntarily followed his master. This was a key moment in his biography. In Germany, he saw with his own eyes the power of the imperial system, understood its principles of operation, and studied its strengths and weaknesses. He was observing the enemy from within, memorizing every detail. After the death of his patron, he did not remain in Germany but went to the monastery of Cluny, the center of the reformist movement, where he finally honed his worldview and made crucial connections with future allies across Europe. When he returned to Rome, he was no longer a naive youth, but a mature politician, a hardened fighter, armed with knowledge, connections, and an unbending will. Rome had forged him into the perfect weapon for the coming war, a man with the soul of an ascetic fanatic and the mind of a Machiavellian strategist. Upon his return to Rome, Hildebrand did not immediately seek the papal throne. He chose a wiser, more far-sighted strategy, to become the one pulling the strings from the shadows. For nearly a quarter of a century, under 5 different popes, he was the gray eminence of the Roman Curia, holding key positions and gradually concentrating real power in his hands. He became the chief architect and driving force of the papal reform. It was he who was behind the decree of 1059, which forever changed the procedure for electing pontiffs. Henceforth, the pope was to be elected not by the Roman nobility or the emperor, but by the College of Cardinals. This was a revolutionary step, snatching the papacy from the hands of secular rulers and turning it into a self-sufficient monarchy. As Archdeacon of the Roman Church, Hildebrand effectively controlled the finances and administration of the Vatican. He forged alliances that seemed unthinkable. Understanding that the papacy was militarily weak, he made a pact with the Normans, recent bandits and invaders who had conquered southern Italy. He legitimized their possessions, and in return, gained their swords to protect the throne of St. Peter from the encroachments of both Roman barons and the German emperor. Every move he made was part of a grand plan. He promoted supporters of the Cluniac reform to key episcopal sees across Europe, creating his own 5th column in the enemy's camp. He dispatched legates, his personal representatives with extraordinary powers, who acted in his name, strengthening papal authority on the ground. He was playing the long game, slowly and methodically placing his pieces on the chessboard, preparing for the final match. By 1073, when Pope Alexander II died, the entire system was in place. The Church had been transformed, the army of reformers mobilized, allies secured. Only one thing was missing: a leader who would not be afraid to pull the trigger. And that leader was to be himself. In the depths of his soul, in the most secret corners of his mind, Hildebrand nurtured an ideology that was like an atomic bomb for its time. It found its concentrated expression in a short document of 27 theses known as Dictatus Papae, the dictates of the Pope. Whether this document was published during his lifetime or was merely an internal memorandum, historians still debate, but its content leaves no doubt about Gregory VII's goals. This was not just a manifesto, it was a declaration of total theocratic power, turning the entire world order on its head. The theses of the Dictatus proclaimed that the Roman Church was founded by God alone, that the Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal, that he alone can depose or reinstate bishops, that he alone may use the imperial insignia, that all princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone, that he may depose emperors, that he himself may be judged by no one, that the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, and finally, that he who is not at peace with the Roman Church shall not be considered Catholic. Each of these points was a direct blow to the foundations of imperial power and the sanctity of the monarch's person. For centuries, it was believed that the emperor was God's anointed, Christ's vicar on earth, responsible for the well-being of the Christian world. But Gregory declared, no, the true vicar of Christ is the Pope. The emperor is merely a secular ruler, like all the others, and if he rules unjustly, the Pope has the full right and even the duty to strip him of his power. This was not just a struggle over investiture, the right to appoint bishops. It was a struggle for supreme sovereignty on earth. Gregory proposed a model of the world where all of Europe is a single Christian state, and the Pope is its supreme ruler, standing above kings and nations, as a shepherd stands over his flock. This radical, almost heretical doctrine for its time became the spiritual and legal basis that allowed the son of a carpenter to challenge the heir of Charlemagne. In April of 1073, during the funeral of Pope Alexander II, something happened that forever changed the course of European history. As the body of the deceased pontiff was being carried into the Lateran Basilica, the huge crowd that filled the cathedral and the square suddenly began to chant, "Hildebrand for Pope. St. Peter has chosen Archdeacon Hildebrand." This was nothing like the orderly election by cardinals that he himself had established. It was a force of nature, the roar of a people who saw in this stern, ascetic man the only one capable of continuing the work of purifying the Church. According to the official version, Hildebrand was stunned. He tried to refuse, climbed into the pulpit to calm the crowd, but his words were drowned out by the deafening cries. The cardinals, seeing such a unanimous expression of will, hastened to legitimize it. Hildebrand was clothed in papal vestments and named Gregory VII in honor of his patron, the reformist Pope Gregory VI. Of course, skeptics argue that this spontaneous acclamation was a well-staged performance, the final brilliant move of the Grey Eminence, who wanted to show that his power came not only from God and the cardinals, but also from the people of Rome. Whatever the case, the election of Gregory VII signaled the beginning of a new era. The age of compromise was over. A man had ascended the throne of St. Peter, who had no intention of negotiating. He intended to demand, to judge, and to punish. His very first encyclical, was like a declaration of war. He wrote of a church mired in sin, of princes trafficking in sacred things, and of his intention to either die or free the Church of God from slavery. All of Europe held its breath. Everyone understood. The carpenter's son who became pope had not come to rule. He had come to hold a last judgment for the powerful of this world, and the first on the list of the accused was the young and ambitious Emperor Henry IV. Having become pope, Gregory VII immediately began to implement his program with iron resolve. His first actions were aimed at creating the foundation for a future theocratic monarchy, a disciplined, centralized, and absolutely loyal army of clergy. To do this, he needed to uproot the two main evils that, in his view, were corrupting the Church and making it dependent on secular power. Simony and Nicolaitism, the marriage of priests. He convened a council in Rome which, under penalty of excommunication, forbade any purchase or sale of church offices. This was a direct blow to the financial and political interests of the entire European aristocracy, from the emperor down to the minor baron, who were accustomed to viewing bishoprics and abbeys as profitable estates for their relatives or as rewards for loyal service. Simultaneously, Gregory cracked down on married clergy with unprecedented severity. He issued decrees forbidding the faithful from receiving sacraments from priests who had wives or concubines. He called on the laity to forcibly expel such priests from their churches. This decision caused a storm of indignation across Europe. Many priests, especially in Germany and northern Italy, had been married for generations. They considered it the norm. Their wives and children were suddenly outlawed. But Gregory was adamant. He understood that a priest free from family ties is completely dependent on his ecclesiastical superiors. His only family becomes the Church, his only father, the Pope. In this way, Gregory was creating a caste of men, torn from their usual social ties, devoted only to Rome. This army of celibate, non-possessive, at least in theory, priests was to become his conduit of influence in every city, in every village of the Christian world, an invisible web entangling all of Europe and converging at a single point, in his hands. At the other end of the chessboard was an opponent worthy of Gregory in willpower and ambition, the young German king and future emperor, Henry IV. He had ascended the throne as a child, and his youth was spent in a humiliating struggle against powerful German princes who effectively ruled the country in his name. This experience hardened him, making him suspicious, cruel, and incredibly power-hungry. By the time of Gregory VII's election, Henry was already an experienced ruler who had suppressed several rebellions and firmly believed in the divine nature of his authority. He, like his predecessors, considered himself Christ's vicar, responsible for the fate of the Church in his domains. The idea that some Italian monk, a carpenter's son, could tell him whom to appoint as bishop in Milan or Cologne seemed to him absurd and blasphemous. For Henry, bishops were not only spiritual shepherds, but also crucial figures in the imperial administration. They were major feudal lords, supplied him with troops, and paid taxes. To give up the right to appoint them meant giving up control over half of his state. The conflict between him and Gregory was inevitable. It was a clash of two mutually exclusive worldviews. Henry represented the old order, where secular and spiritual power were merged in the figure of the monarch. Gregory carried the banner of a new order, where spiritual power stands immeasurably higher than secular. Henry was young, hot-headed, confident in his military strength and the support of the German episcopate, which owed him everything. He did not see the Pope as a serious threat, considering him just another idealistic fanatic. He did not yet understand that Gregory possessed a weapon against which swords and spears were powerless, a weapon capable of turning the emperor's own subjects against him. The collision of these two titans was to decide who would rule Europe, the emperor or the pope, the crown or the tiara. The central battlefield, the apple of discord between Gregory and Henry, was the issue of investiture. This term, which seems purely technical today, was synonymous with supreme power in the 11th century. Investiture was the act of installing a new bishop or abbot into office, symbolically expressed by the bestowing of a ring and a staff. The ring symbolized a spiritual marriage to the diocese, and the staff, pastoral authority. From time immemorial, this rite was performed by the emperor or a king. By presenting these symbols to the future bishop, the monarch showed that he was the source of his authority, both spiritual and secular. For the emperors, this was not just a tradition, but a vital necessity. Prince-bishops controlled vast territories and resources. By appointing his loyal men, relatives, friends, devoted servants to these posts, the emperor strengthened his power and created a counterbalance to the mighty secular dukes. For Gregory, however, lay investiture was the root of all evil, the quintessence of the Church's slavery. He believed that by accepting the ring and staff from the hands of a layman, even an emperor, a cleric was committing an act of simony, buying a spiritual office at the price of his loyalty. It was a sacrilege that turned servants of God into servants of Caesar. Therefore, the fight for investiture was for Gregory not a political issue, but a deeply religious, eschatological one. He was fighting for the salvation of souls, for the purity of the Church. He demanded that bishops be elected by the clergy and the people, and confirmed by the Pope. This completely shattered the imperial system of governance. The conflict reached a boiling point over the Archbishopric of Milan, one of the richest and most influential in Italy. Both Henry and Gregory appointed their own candidates. This was the moment of truth. To yield meant to lose the entire war, and neither of them was going to back down. In February of 1075, Gregory VII made his move. The Great Lenten Synod was held in Rome, where the Pope, with unprecedented clarity, formulated his demands and threats. He not only condemned simony and clerical marriage, but for the first time, he officially and under threat of anathema forbade any form of lay investiture. Any emperor, king, duke, or count who dared to bestow a ring and staff upon a bishop would be automatically excommunicated from the Church. Any cleric who accepted an office from the hands of a layman would be stripped of his rank. This was a direct and unequivocal ultimatum to Henry IV. The Synod's decree was immediately dispatched throughout Europe. At the same time, Gregory sent a personal message to Henry, its tone both paternal and menacing. He rebuked the king for continuing to associate with his excommunicated counselors and for persisting in the practice of simony, particularly in Milan. The Pope called on Henry to repent, reminding him of the fate of the biblical King Saul, who was rejected by God for his disobedience. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat. If Henry did not submit to the will of the Apostolic See, he would face not only the wrath of God, but also a very real papal sentence. Gregory had thrown down the gauntlet. He was deliberately escalating the conflict, believing that his spiritual authority and the support of reformist circles throughout Europe were strong enough to withstand a head-on collision with imperial power. He underestimated the pride and stubbornness of his opponent, but at the same time, he laid the legal and moral groundwork for his next, truly devastating blow. Henry IV, upon receiving the Pope's message, was enraged. He had just won a brilliant military victory over the rebellious Saxons and was at the peak of his power. The threats from some monk, whom he considered a usurper who had ascended the papal throne not by canon law, but by the will of the Roman mob, seemed to him an outrageous insolence. He decided to strike back, and in a way that would put the Pope in his place once and for all. In January of 1076, Henry convened a council of German bishops in the city of Worms. The vast majority of them were his appointees. They had received their dioceses from his hands and were displeased with Gregory's reforms, which threatened their power and way of life. The atmosphere at the council was electric. A cardinal hostile to Gregory read out a long list of accusations against the Pope. He was called a perjurer, a usurper, a sorcerer, a man sowing discord and war. The bishops, incited by Henry, unanimously declared Gregory VII deposed. They composed a derogatory message addressed to Hildebrand, no longer Pope, but a false monk. In this letter, they refused to obey him and demanded that he abandon the throne of St. Peter. Henry himself wrote a separate, even more insulting letter. He addressed Gregory informally and accused him of all mortal sins, concluding his message with a formidable call. I, Henry, king by the grace of God, with all our bishops, say to you, descend, descend, you who are damned throughout the ages. Henry was certain of his victory. He sent these decrees to Rome, expecting them to cause turmoil, and that the Romans themselves would expel the hated Pope. He had made a fatal mistake. He judged Gregory by his own standards, thinking he would be frightened and would retreat. But he was dealing not with a politician, but with a prophet who was only waiting for a pretext to unleash upon his enemy the full power of his new, unprecedented weapon. When Henry's messengers arrived in Rome and read the decrees of the Synod of Worms at a session of the Lateran Council, the effect was the exact opposite of what the emperor had intended. The bishops and cardinals were furious at such blasphemy. Guards loyal to the Pope nearly tore the envoys to pieces on the spot. Gregory, however, unlike everyone else, remained icily calm. He waited for the uproar to subside and delivered one of the most famous and fateful speeches in history. Addressing St. Peter, he spoke as his direct heir and vicar. He listed all of Henry's transgressions, his rebellion against the Church, and then pronounced the terrible words of the sentence. By the authority vested in me by God, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I forbid King Henry, son of Emperor Henry, from ruling the kingdom of the Teutons and of Italy. I release all Christians from the oath they have sworn or will swear to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king. And then he placed a personal anathema upon him. I excommunicate him from the Church, so that the nations may know and see that you are Peter, and on this rock the Son of the living God has built his Church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. This was an unprecedented act. Never before in history had a pope dared to depose an emperor. It was more than a political decision. It was a theological explosion, a nuclear strike on the sacred foundations of monarchy. Gregory did not just excommunicate Henry from the sacraments. He declared his rule illegitimate, severed the feudal bonds that tied the emperor to his vassals, and effectively outlawed him. He transformed God's anointed into a mere mortal, a sinner, stripped of power and subject to universal contempt. Now, all that remained was to wait and see if this weapon would work. Would the world of the 11th century believe that the son of a carpenter could indeed overthrow emperors by his will alone? To understand why a papal excommunication in the 11th century was more terrifying than any army, one must delve into the mind of a medieval person. Their world was permeated with faith. God, the devil, heaven, and hell were not abstract concepts, but a tangible reality, far more important than earthly life. The Church was the only institution that could grant salvation or condemn to eternal torment. And the keys to heaven, according to the Gospel, were given to the Apostle Peter and his successors, the popes. Excommunication from the Church, or anathema, was not just a symbolic gesture. It had terrifying consequences, both spiritual and social. An excommunicated person became an outcast. He could not attend church, receive communion, or confess. After death, he faced certain hell. But his earthly life also turned into a nightmare. No one had the right to speak to him, eat at the same table, or do business with him. His servants would leave him. His vassals were released from their oath of fealty. His wife could leave him. His children were considered illegitimate. He became a living dead man, a leper from whom everyone recoiled in horror. When Gregory excommunicated Henry, he used this spiritual weapon for political ends with brilliant foresight. He didn't just declare the emperor a sinner. He provided a legal and, more importantly, a sacred justification for rebellion to all those in Germany who were dissatisfied with Henry. And there were many. The powerful dukes of Swabia, Bavaria, and Carinthia, as well as the Saxons, recently defeated but not broken, hated Henry for his attempts to strengthen central authority at their expense. They had long been looking for a pretext to revolt. And now the Pope had given them that pretext, wrapped in the mantle of divine justice. Now their rebellion was not treason, but a pious act, the fulfillment of the will of the vicar of St. Peter. Gregory had turned a feudal strife into a holy war. The news of Henry's excommunication spread like wildfire across Europe, and the effect surpassed Gregory's wildest expectations. In Germany, a real political collapse began. The emperor's once loyal allies, the bishops who had so boldly declared the Pope deposed at Worms, began one by one to repent and seek reconciliation with Rome. They realized their own flocks might turn away from them if they supported an excommunicated monarch. But the most severe blow to Henry was dealt by the secular princes. His enemies, Rudolph of Swabia, Welf of Bavaria, and others, immediately seized the opportunity. They gathered at an assembly in Triber and openly declared that they no longer considered Henry their king. They issued an ultimatum. If Henry did not obtain forgiveness from the Pope within a year and a day of his excommunication, they would elect a new king. It was a catastrophe. The entire structure of imperial power, which rested on the personal oaths of vassals, was crumbling before his eyes. Henry found himself completely isolated. His orders were no longer obeyed. His army was melting away. He rushed around Germany trying to gather supporters, but everywhere he met a wall of hostility or cowardly neutrality. He suddenly realized that his opponent was not an old man in Rome, but something far more powerful. Public opinion, religious fear, and the political calculations of his own princes. He understood that he was losing not a war of swords, but a war of ideas. Gregory, from 1,000 miles away, with a single stroke of his pen, had achieved what the German princes could not accomplish with years of armed rebellions. He had turned the all-powerful emperor into a political bankrupt who had only one option left, humiliating and desperate, to personally go to the Pope and beg for forgiveness. The ultimatum issued by the princes at Tribur in October of 1076 left Henry with no choice. He had 1 year to have the excommunication lifted, or he would lose his crown forever. The princes also invited Pope Gregory himself to come to Augsburg the following February to personally judge the king's case. Henry could not allow this. A trial on German soil, surrounded by his enemies, would mean certain deposition. He needed to seize the initiative, meet with the Pope alone, on neutral ground, and receive absolution before the Augsburg Assembly. And so he resolved to take an unprecedented step. In the dead of winter, the harshest time of year, when the Alpine passes were considered impassable, Henry, with his wife, young son, and a small retinue, secretly set off for Italy. This journey was an act of pure desperation. Chronicles describe the horrors of the crossing. They had to crawl along icy paths, risking a fall into the abyss at any moment. Horses were lowered down with ropes. The Empress and her ladies-in-waiting were seated on ox hides and dragged through the snow. This passage across the snow-covered Alps became a powerful symbol of Henry's fall. He, the proud emperor, master of the world, was now a fugitive in his own land, forced to sneak like a thief to save his crown. He journeyed not as a conqueror, but as a penitent sinner, going to bow before the one he had contemptuously called a false monk just a year before. The news that Henry was heading to Italy caught Gregory by surprise. The Pope was on his way to Germany for that very trial in Augsburg. Fearing that Henry was coming with an army, Gregory took refuge in the impregnable castle of Canossa, which belonged to his loyal ally, Margravine Matilda of Tuscany. It was here, at the walls of this fortress, that the final scene of the great drama was to unfold. The castle of Canossa, where Gregory took refuge, belonged to one of the most powerful women of medieval Europe, Matilda, Margravine of Tuscany. She was a fervent supporter of the papal reform and a personal friend of Gregory VII. Her vast domains in northern Italy controlled the key roads from Germany to Rome, making her a strategically vital ally for the Pope. Matilda was a woman of outstanding intellect, education, and strength of will. She personally led troops into battle and engaged in complex diplomatic games. By granting refuge to Gregory, she became an unwitting arbiter in the greatest conflict of the age. It was in her castle, under her protection, that two worlds met. The old world of imperial domination, embodied by Henry, and the new world of papal theocracy, personified by Gregory. Henry's arrival at the walls of Canossa put everyone in a difficult position. Henry came not with an army, as the Pope had feared, but in the clothes of a penitent sinner. He was not demanding, but begging. This changed the situation completely. Now Gregory faced a dilemma. As a priest, as the vicar of Christ, he could not refuse forgiveness to a repentant sinner. The gospel explicitly commanded to forgive one's enemies. But as a politician, he understood that by forgiving Henry, he would deprive the German princes of their reason for rebellion and restore power to his enemy. It was a difficult choice between the duty of a pastor and the calculation of a ruler. Matilda of Tuscany, as well as Abbot Hugh of Cluny, Henry's godfather, who were in the castle, acted as mediators, imploring Gregory to show mercy. But the Pope hesitated. He wanted not just to forgive, he wanted to humiliate. He wanted the whole world to see the Holy Roman Emperor on his knees before the son of a carpenter. And then began what has forever gone down in history as the Walk to Canossa. On January 25th, 1077, in the bitter cold, by Gregory's command, the gates of the castle's outer courtyard were opened. Henry was allowed in, but alone, without his retinue. His royal garments were removed, and he was dressed in a coarse hair shirt, the attire of a penitent sinner, and he was left to stand barefoot in the snow before the gates of the inner citadel, where the Pope resided. One day passed like this, then a second, then a third. For 3 days, from dawn till dusk, the descendant of Charlemagne, the ruler of most of the Christian world, stood in the piercing wind, hungry and frozen, publicly demonstrating his repentance. This was not just a penance. It was a brilliantly staged political spectacle. The whole world had to see this living image. Secular power, proud and mighty, humbly begging for forgiveness from spiritual power. Every hour that Henry spent in the snow was a hammer blow to the prestige and sanctity of imperial authority. Gregory was demonstrating his superiority, reveling in his victory. He was showing that it was he, the Pope, who was the supreme judge over all kings and emperors. Chroniclers sympathetic to the Pope described the event as the just punishment of a tyrant. Those who sympathized with the emperor spoke of the unheard-of cruelty and pride of a priest who had forgotten Christian mercy. But both sides agreed on one thing. The world had never seen anything like it. The son of a carpenter had forced the most powerful monarch in Europe to endure a ritual of the deepest public humiliation. While Henry was freezing in the snow, intense behind-the-scenes negotiations were taking place within the castle walls. It was a complex political theater where each participant pursued their own goals. Matilda of Tuscany and Abbot Hugh of Cluny, moved by compassion and political pragmatism, acted as intercessors. They shuttled between the weeping emperor and the unyielding pope, begging the latter to show mercy. They appealed to his pastoral duty, reminding him that refusing forgiveness to a repentant sinner was a mortal sin for a priest. Henry, for his part, played his role to the hilt. He wept, beat his chest, and showed complete contrition. But behind this humiliation lay a cold calculation. He knew that every hour of his penance worked against Gregory, portraying the Pope not as a just judge, but as a cruel and vindictive tyrant. He was turning his defeat into a moral victory. Gregory, meanwhile, was caught in a trap of his own making. He had reached the pinnacle of his triumph, but did not know what to do next. He understood that if he forgave Henry, the emperor, upon regaining his power, would immediately seek revenge. If he refused forgiveness, he himself would violate all church canons and incur the condemnation of the entire Christian world. He tried to buy time, setting more and more conditions. He demanded public oaths from Henry, guarantees of his own safety on the way to Germany, and promises to submit to papal decisions on the issue of investiture. In effect, he was trying to obtain from Henry a full and unconditional recognition of papal supremacy. This diplomatic duel was no less intense than Henry's physical ordeal in the cold. It was a struggle between two great minds, two unbending wills, and its outcome was to determine the future of Europe. Finally, on the fourth day, January 28th, Gregory yielded. Perhaps he realized that further delay would turn against him. Perhaps he was moved by Matilda's tears and the persuasions of Abbot Hugh. The gates of the citadel opened. Henry, exhausted and frozen, was brought inside. There, in the presence of witnesses, the scene of forgiveness took place. The emperor, weeping, fell to his knees before the Pope, kissed his feet, and begged for absolution. Gregory, seeing his repentance, lifted the excommunication. He celebrated Mass, during which they took communion together, symbolizing their complete reconciliation. To the outside world, this was a moment of absolute triumph for the papacy. The carpenter's son stood while the emperor lay at his feet. The ideas of the Dictatus Papae had been brought to life. It seemed that from now on, secular power would be subordinate to the spiritual. But beneath the surface of this theatrical reconciliation lay a very different reality. Henry got what he came for. The excommunication was lifted. He was once again the legitimate king in the eyes of his subjects. The legal basis for the German prince's rebellion had vanished. He had bought time and saved his crown. Gregory, on the other hand, while formally victorious, had in fact made a strategic blunder. By forgiving Henry, he had released a dangerous and mortally offended enemy from his cage. He had disappointed the German opposition, which had counted on his support. He had shown that he could be forced to act against his own political interests if one skillfully appealed to his pastoral duty. The moment of triumph at Canossa became the beginning of the end for Gregory himself. He had won the battle, but had laid the groundwork for his future defeat. To understand the true scale of the drama at Canossa, one must look into the souls of its main protagonists. What did Henry truly feel, standing barefoot in the snow? Undoubtedly, humiliation, shame, and helpless rage. All his pride, his entire conception of the divinity of royal power, was trampled. It was a scar that would stay with him for the rest of his life, fueling his thirst for revenge. But behind this humiliation was a cold and sober calculation. He was a pragmatist who understood that sometimes, to win a war, you must lose a battle. He played the part of a repentant sinner, but in his heart, he remained an emperor simply doing what was necessary to preserve his power. His tears were a weapon, and his penance was a tactical maneuver. And what of Gregory? Outwardly, he was the triumphant judge of the world. He saw his dream made manifest, the emperor at his feet. In those moments, he must have felt like the true vicar of God, the arbiter of earthly destinies. But a storm was surely raging in his soul. He was torn between the role of an all-forgiving pastor and that of a ruthless politician. In forgiving Henry, he acted as a priest, but betrayed his political goals. He understood that forgiveness was not the end, but merely a respite in the war. Perhaps deep down, he despised Henry not only for his sins, but also for his abasement, seeing him as a weak and unworthy ruler. And finally, Matilda of Tuscany. She was a witness, and in a way, the director of this drama. As a faithful daughter of the Church, she rejoiced in the Pope's triumph. But as a ruler, she understood the full danger of the situation. She saw that the reconciliation was fragile and unnatural, and that the storm that had subsided at Canossa would soon break out with a new, even more terrible force, with her own lands at its epicenter. The events at Canossa became the peak of Gregory VII's power, but ironically, it was this stunning victory that sealed his ultimate defeat. By forgiving Henry, the Pope made a fatal strategic error. First, he restored legitimacy to his sworn enemy. The lifting of the anathema meant that Henry was once again the lawful king. The German princes, who were ready to elect a new monarch, were thrown into confusion. Their main argument, that one could not obey an excommunicated ruler, was knocked out from under them. Gregory had, in essence, betrayed his German allies, who had staked everything on his support. They still elected an anti-king, Rudolph of Swabia, which plunged Germany into a long and bloody civil war. But now it was no longer a matter of divine right, but a common feudal squabble. Second, Henry, having endured the humiliation, was not broken. On the contrary, he was hardened. He had learned his lesson. The Pope could be fought not only with the sword, but also with his own weapons. Demonstrative penance and appeals to canon law. He left Canossa saved, but not forgiven in his heart. From that moment on, his sole purpose was revenge. He began to methodically restore his power in Germany, while simultaneously playing a subtle diplomatic game in Italy, turning all those dissatisfied with Gregory's reforms against him. Canossa, instead of being the final chapter in the conflict, became merely a comma. It showed the world that a pope could humiliate an emperor, but it also showed that this humiliation was not final and did not strip the monarch of real military and political power. Gregory won the moral battle, but lost the political war that followed. After Canossa, the pendulum of history swung back. Henry IV, having restored his authority in Germany after several years of civil war in which his rival Rudolph of Swabia was killed, decided to finish with Gregory for good. In 1080, he once again convened a council of loyal bishops, who again declared Gregory deposed and elected an antipope, Clement III. And then Henry did what Gregory had so feared. He led his army to Rome. A long and grueling siege of the Eternal City began. The Romans, who had initially supported Gregory, grew tired of war and hardship. Henry, skillfully using bribery and promises, won many of them over to his side. In 1084, the city fell. Henry IV entered Rome in triumph, and his antipope, Clement III, crowned him emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. And Gregory VII, the legitimate pope, found himself under siege in the Castel Sant'Angelo, a few hundred meters from his triumphant enemy. He had been betrayed by almost everyone. The only ones who came to his aid were his long-standing allies, the Normans from southern Italy. They broke into Rome and freed the Pope, but their help turned into a catastrophe. The wild Norman warriors went on a terrible rampage in the city, looting and burning entire districts. The people of Rome, suffering at the hands of their own liberators, came to hate Gregory, seeing him as the cause of all their woes. He could no longer stay in his city. The Normans took him with them to the south, to Salerno. This was no longer an honorable journey, but a true exile. The son of a carpenter, who had made an emperor kneel before him, was now an exile, stripped of everything. On the 25th of May, 1085, in exile in Salerno, Gregory VII died. His last words, which became legendary, perfectly summed up his tragic life. "I have loved justice and hated iniquity. Therefore I die in exile." In these words, one can hear both the bitterness of defeat and an unshakable belief in his own righteousness. From the perspective of short-term politics, he had lost. He died far from Rome, while his enemy Henry and the anti-pope Clement ruled in the Eternal City. He failed to fully implement his program of papal theocracy. He left behind a divided church and a Germany ablaze with civil war. It seemed that his life's work had collapsed. But death is only the beginning of a historical legacy. Gregory lost his personal war with Henry, but he won the war for the future. The ideas he defended with such fanatical obsession did not die with him. They had put down such deep roots that it was impossible to eradicate them. He forever changed the nature of papal power. After him, the papacy was never again just a spiritual institution. It became a powerful, centralized monarchy, an active player on the European political stage. The investiture controversy he started continued for almost another 40 years and ended with the Concordat of Worms in 1122, a compromise that nevertheless enshrined many of the principles for which Gregory had fought. He set a precedent. By showing that a pope could depose emperors, he gave his successors a terrible weapon that they would use throughout the Middle Ages, holding the most powerful monarchs of Europe in fear. His death in exile was not a defeat, but a martyr's crown that only strengthened his legend and the holiness of his cause. The ghost of Gregory VII continued to rule Europe for many centuries after his death. He lost the battle, but won the war of principles. He was the architect of the medieval papacy, transforming it from a weak, dependent institution into a mighty transnational corporation of power. His successors, like Innocent III, who no longer called himself the Vicar of St. Peter, but the Vicar of Christ, brought his ideas to their logical conclusion, asserting that the Pope stands between God and man, lower than God, but higher than men, who judges all and is judged by no one. The entire history of the relationship between church and state in the following centuries is, in essence, a development of or reaction to the Gregorian Revolution. Kings and emperors constantly fought with the papacy for power, but they could never reclaim the sacred status they held before Canossa. Gregory drew a clear dividing line between the spiritual and secular spheres, and although he himself sought to subordinate the latter to the former, in the long run, this led to the birth of the idea of secularism. By setting the Church apart as an independent legal and political force, he paradoxically created the conditions for the future development of the autonomous secular state. The great disputes between Philip the Fair and Boniface VIII, the Reformation, the Peace of Westphalia. All these events are distant echoes of the earthquake that the carpenter's son set off in the 11th century. He laid the foundation for the Europe we know, with its eternal tension between faith and reason, between the church pulpit and the royal throne. His legacy is twofold. For some, he is a saint, a fearless reformer who saved the church from decay. For others, a power-hungry fanatic who drowned Europe in blood for his theocratic utopia. But no one can deny his greatness. He was one of those rare people in history who, by the force of his will and his ideas, managed to turn back the river of time and direct it into a new channel. So how, in the end, did the son of a carpenter manage to make an emperor beg for forgiveness barefoot in the snow? What is the solution to this dramatic paradox? The answer is multi-layered. First, Gregory was not just a monk. By the time of his election, he was the most experienced politician and administrator in Rome, who had been preparing the ground for his revolution for decades. He created an ideology, reformed the administration, and found allies. Second, he acted at the perfect moment. The crisis in the church was so deep that a thirst for reform had seized broad sections of society. The ideas of the Cluniac movement had prepared people's minds to accept his radical program. Third, and most importantly, Gregory understood and harnessed the great power of his age, the power of faith. He created a new technology of power. He understood that in a world where everyone, from king to peasant, believes in heaven and hell, the keys to heaven are the most powerful weapon. Excommunication, the anathema, became in his hands a tool not of spiritual, but of political coercion. He turned religious dogma into a weapon of mass destruction, capable of shattering feudal oaths, paralyzing states, and sowing rebellion. He had hacked the operating system of medieval society. Emperor Henry thought in terms of military strength, armies, castles, vassals. Gregory, however, thought in intangible categories: legitimacy, sin, salvation, and damnation. And in the 11th century, the intangible proved stronger than the material. The carpenter's son won because he was not just a politician, but the media magnate and ideologue of his time. He managed to convince millions of people that he was right, and this collective belief proved to be a force before which even the emperor's armored cavalry had to retreat. Canossa is a monument not so much to the strength of one man, as to the power of an idea that has captured the masses. The eternal lesson of Canossa extends far beyond the 11th century and the Investiture Controversy. This story poses a fundamental question that remains relevant to this day. Where is the line between the power of Caesar and the power of God? Between the sphere of the state and the sphere of conscience? Gregory VII gave his own radical answer to this question. There is no line. All power belongs to God and his vicar on earth. Henry IV defended the opposite principle. The ruler, anointed by God, is himself the head of the Church in his own domains. Their clash is the eternal struggle between two legitimacies, two sources of authority, which continues in the modern world, albeit in different forms. It is the struggle between secular law and religious norms, between civic duty and the dictates of faith. The story of Gregory and Henry teaches us that power is not just about swords and money. There is also soft power, the power of ideas, beliefs, and symbols, which can sometimes be far more effective than brute force. He who controls the minds and souls of people ultimately controls their bodies as well. It is also a warning about the dangers of extremism and fanaticism, no matter the banner under which they march. Gregory, in his pursuit of an ideal church, did not hesitate to plunge half of Europe into the chaos of civil war. His story is the tragedy of a man who loved divine justice so much that he sometimes forgot about human mercy. And finally, Canossa is an eternal reminder that even the most powerful rulers, the most impregnable empires, can find themselves helpless when a single person, armed only with the strength of their faith and an unbending will, decides to challenge them. Therein lies the enduring greatness and terror of the story of the carpenter's son who brought an empire to its knees.